You're listening to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music. Tune in weekly as we interview music teachers and experts from around the world to explore creative activities and ideas that build learning connections in students. Our integrated music teaching approach will deepen your students' understanding of musical concepts, engage them in critical thinking, improve their reading and performance, foster their curiosity, and prepare them for a lifetime of music making.
Tara right here, and welcome back to the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast from Top Music Co. At Top Music, we love guiding and supporting music teachers just like you to engage, motivate, and inspire your students and run the most sustainable studio business possible using our integrated music teaching system. It's great to be with you for another week of the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast. We have another episode from the archives today about insights on piano student retention and why it's important. We'll explore the key factors on why piano students are quitting and what we can do to retain our students for longer.
My guest today is Karen Gerelus, who's a third-generation piano teacher and scholar whose work has been featured in prominent academic journals and pedagogy conferences. She holds a Master of Arts in Piano Pedagogy, several artist diplomas, and is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Calgary, where her research focuses on identity and motivation in piano students. We had a lot of similarities in some of our views and thoughts about particularly identity around the teenage years as musicians. So it's great to see that she's actually doing some research on that topic. Let's welcome Karen now to the show. Thanks for being here, Karen Gerelus.
Thanks so much. I am so excited to be with you and so excited to be on a podcast among so many colleagues that I recognize and see so highly their work. I am honored to be among people like Samantha Coates and Layla Viss and all the people, Anita Collins, all the people you've interviewed for the last few years.
We were just talking about Liz Craig as well, one of your fellow country people. It is really funny to know how small the world is in so many ways. And we're just talking about catching up at conferences and things like that. Unfortunately, don't think we're going to be able to do that for a little while, which is a bit sad, but great that we can do it like this anyway. So Karen, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're based, and do you teach a little bit about your sort of studio?
Yeah, of course I teach. I teach probably too much at the moment. I have 34 students in my private studio here. I also teach at the Mount Royal University Conservatory. I teach quite a lot of piano, but also the advanced theory subjects, music history, pedagogy. The reason I say probably more than I should is because I'm also a new mom. I have a 3-month-old baby upstairs.
Oh, congratulations. Wow.
Thank you. But I work with such a great group of students that I couldn't imagine letting them go for the typical maternity leave and starting over. So I love what I do. And I've put a lot of energy and thought into the art of teaching. So in my studio, I teach both Suzuki and Royal Conservatory, and blending the two together, I will go to my grave saying this: I teach the student, not the curriculum. And so really trying to connect that way, regardless of the typical path of what I should be doing.
It's a lovely looking studio behind you. While the people listening won't be able to see it, you've got 2 grand pianos side by side, and it looks like it might be part of your living room, is it?
It's a walkout basement. Yes.
Wow. Walk out basement. So it's outside on the ground level. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. You call that a walkout basement. There you go. Yeah. Isn't it funny? In Australia, we'd call that a granny flat, like where your granny might live in. It looks really nice. Really, really nice.
Thank you. Thank you. I've put a lot of time and energy into not only how I teach, but where I teach to make this something really special for students.
And we're recording this in October. Are you back to in-person teaching where you are in Calgary?
I gave my students the option of what they would like to do, since everybody has different comfort levels right now with everything happening in the world. And I would say 85% of my students are back in the studio, and about 15% are on Zoom with the necessary precautions. It's easy now that I have 2 grand pianos. They have their piano and I have mine, and we can stay apart quite easily.
Well, the reason I was so keen to speak with you is to do with some of the research you've been doing. So not only are you a busy new mum, piano teacher, but you're also a researcher and an academic. And you've put together a number of research articles and a thesis. But the one we're talking about today is a more recent one Would you like to just tell us about it, what it's called, and we'll start diving in a little bit?
Sure. So this article is, like giving birth all over again. It's been 5 years in the making through my graduate work at the University of Ottawa with Professor Como, Michael Swarp, Dr. Veronica Huda, and the piano lab there. So this article is called Parting Ways with Piano Lessons, Comparing Motivation Between Continuing and Dropout Piano Students. And so when I came into my graduate work, we called it the low-hanging fruit study, that we couldn't believe nobody had looked at motivation and students who quit. And so I've dedicated about the last 5 years of my life to think about this topic.
It's amazing how long. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. How many pages? It must be, 12 pages or something like that. And to think that that's taken you 5 years, I mean, it's just extraordinary what goes in. I think I'm not an academic. I haven't been in a university and I haven't written a thesis. So I think I take for granted the amount of time that goes into these things.
I have thought about every word more than once. So the 5 years started with the data collection. And then I had this enormous amount of data because there were 55 former piano students. So we called them the dropouts. And we compared them with 260 students who were continuing and had intentions to continue with lessons. And so naturally, there was an enormous amount of data, which had to be made sense of, and a lot of statistical analyses, but also qualitative research where we were asking students things in their own words, and then trying to boil that down into what did we learn? What are the most important things that we can take away from this enormous amount of data, sending it to different journals, seeing who is interested to publish it, going through rounds of revisions, and then finally seeing it in print. So I'm quite proud of this work.
You should be. And we're going to dive into what it all means. But before we do that, and we ask you, why do students drop out? Why did you focus? You mentioned that this study hadn't been done before, but was there any other reason that you wanted to focus on retention?
Well, to be very particular, we focused on attrition rather than retention. Okay. So the reasons students drop out rather than the reasons they stay. And so naturally, if you take the inverse of the question, you can get to the reasons for retention. But if I'm being very particular, we focused on attrition. So the research tells us that while there are almost as many reasons as there are pieces of research about why students quit. And we all have students quit. In my practical studio, I'll be the first to admit that even though I am the researcher on why students quit, I still have students who quit. I have to be very clear on that. I also have to be clear on that teachers really take it personally when students quit. I saw this happen to many of my colleagues and even my mom, who was a piano teacher, who used to get really bent out of shape about what could they have done differently. So there's a lot of a personal connection to this work as well. So why did I decide to focus on attrition? It's because we think it happens too frequently. Because we don't actually know how many piano students there are or how long they take piano lessons for. This would be an enormous piece of research. It would be so valuable. When we look at the landscape of how many piano students are there in North America, we have no idea. We can't even really make a best guess.
Even teachers, we don't even know, really.
We don't even know how many teachers are actively teaching. That's right. And so we also have no idea how long piano students take piano lessons for along the way. And so this is a calling to anybody listening for a longitudinal study. This would be an enormous doctoral work or even life study for other academics, but we could really use a longitudinal study on this topic. If anybody would take that up, I would be happy to read it or even collaborate. So in my current work, I've just started kind of informally asking teachers, if there were 100 beginners who started lessons this year, how many of them would eventually make it to advanced piano study? And you can make an argument, is that the right thing to ask? Do we need all students to get to advanced piano study? Maybe, maybe not. But we want our students to be able to play fluently and confidently. Anyway, so of that 100, these teachers I've been asking, the average is 2.
Wow.
2 students might make it to advanced piano study. And so my question is, well, what happened to the others? And ultimately, this is my own story, to get a bit personal here, is because when I was 13, I was a little snotty piano student and I quit piano lessons. And this was the one week my dad drove me to lessons. And I said, Dad, I'm quitting piano lessons. And he said, okay. And my mom was so mad when we came home from the lesson 55 minutes early, wondering what had happened. So I never left music entirely. I was always in choirs and bands and things like that. And I eventually smartened up. But I quit piano, and here I am as a piano teacher and a researcher and somebody who's very passionate about the topic. So what went wrong? And these are all the questions that are rattling around in my mind since then.
It was really interesting to read in your report that you went through some of the other research that was out there, which predicted some key factors for students quitting. And I just wondered, maybe you could just speak very quickly to some of these, because there's quite a few. But I was interested in one of them was demanding, distant or disinterested parents. Now I can, because that's two sides of the equation. There's ones that are demanding and want you to practice. The other ones are the ones that don't care. And they both have a negative effect, or can do.
Yes, that's right. So this is other research. I think it's Teresa Cardos-Camilli had done some work in this area. It was the quality of parental involvement, not the amount, but the quality of parents in her studies that she was looking at. And you're right, those are two completely opposite things. My good friend, Dr. Merlin Thompson, would say that of his parents, he asks them to be interested and involved, and that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be interested and involved? And that is, in his opinion, what leads to successful piano students and happy piano parents. But parents are one of the things that come up quite often in studies about students who quit music lessons.
Yeah, and there was also something in your report too about the impact of parents being in the music lesson.
Yes.
Now, that really surprised me. Can you just tell us about that? Just a quick tangent.
Yeah, so there was actually a negative correlation, which means that more parents were involved with music lessons, the less autonomously motivated that students felt. So the less they felt like they had control over their own lessons, the less they felt like they were happy about how things were going and guiding themselves. So the higher levels of parental involvement resulted in a lower level of motivation. And that really surprised us, because it flies in the face of all of the research that we had been reading. The literature was showing that parental involvement usually creates higher quality learning. It develops great student practice habits. More parental involvement usually results in students having a better self-concept of who they are in music. It results in students who are more interested in piano performance and other musical activities in their lives. And so that's usually what we were expecting to find. We had to extrapolate some things here to try and think about, well, why did we find the exact opposite? And we came to not a conclusion, but a suggestion that it could be that these parents were overstepping their boundaries and being too demanding. This wasn't in the work that we're talking about, but it was in the study in general, that there were an unusual number of stay-at-home moms in the study. And we wondered if having your mom there all the time, who always knows the right answer, could that be interpreted as stepping on your toes?
I can see that.
Yes. I was that person with the stay-at-home mom who had the piano teacher mom. Sorry, Mom, but did I, when I was a snotty little 13-year-old, did I interpret that as squashing my sense of autonomy? And I was wrestling with that. And is that one of the reasons I dropped out? So anyway, long story short, the quality of parental involvement is really important, and it has to be sensitively offered.
We'll talk about some of these other ones a bit later on, but there were some more obvious reasons in the research that you cited. For example, disliking the repertoire, and that came up a few times. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a bit more detail. And just having a poor relationship with the teacher. We know how important relationships are between the student and the teacher, and also the parent to that matter. So perhaps we'll talk about those a little bit later on, because I think they come up in your own work as well as the research that you did on other studies. So let's talk about motivation, because this was one of the ways that you measured this whole element of attrition. And we all know about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation and know that intrinsic is best. Correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here, because you're the expert. Intrinsic motivation is the best for sustained work in anything that somebody does. But your research actually looked more at the type rather than the amount of motivation. And so I had to do a little bit of thinking about this. So can you tell us how that works? And there's a name for it and everything too, I think.
Yes. So this is from the theory of motivation that we used in this study is called self-determination theory. Samantha Coates also talked about this in her interview with you. And guys, if you haven't listened to that podcast, go over there right as soon as you're done here and listen to Samantha Coates talk about motivation, because she is as excited about self-determination theory as I am.
We'll put a link in the show notes to that. It was a 3-part series, actually. She's just fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah. So self-determination theory looked at motivation and thought, no, this extrinsic, intrinsic thing is really too simple to describe this whole variety of human motivation. And so they came up with a chart, and I'll sort of talk my way through it if I can. It's a little bit complicated, but perhaps we can post a photo of it somewhere later.
Yeah, we can do that in the show notes too. And you also send a great little video too, which we can share too.
Yeah, also a really, really brief, snappy way about summing up some key points about self-determination theory. But it's argued that this spectrum of motivation is one of the most significant things that the theory has offered to psychology literature. So this is Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. They're psychologists from the University of Rochester. And their spectrum of motivation starts at the extreme left with amotivation. That's not a word I think that's been brought up yet. And amotivation is, I don't care about that at all. It's, I don't value that. I don't have control about that, over that. I have no desire to act in any other way. So for example, that's like a student saying, I'm not practicing that because I don't care about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sure we have students like that, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And children sometimes too.
Yeah. We're going to migrate across the scale a little bit to the left where we get into controlled motivation. That's their word for extrinsic motivation. And this is something like external rewards and punishments. So for example, practicing this 10 times will earn you $1. That's a very simple way of the stereotypical classic extrinsic motivation. As we go along, the motivation becomes more internalized, we would say. So there's introjected and identified motivation. And so this is working towards a level of personal importance. I consciously value this. Something like, for example, I know I should play my scales because they're good for me. So there is a little bit of an external push there. It's probably been assigned by a teacher, and I don't really want to do it, but I'm going to do this because I know it's good for me. As we move further along the scale here, we get even more internalized. And as you hit the extreme right side of the scale, that's where intrinsic motivation comes in. And this is just pure interest and enjoyment and satisfaction. It's what we hope for all of our students because it leads to long-term well-being. So for example, this was somebody who said, I would just play the piano all day if I could. I love this.
Right. Now, of course, that is really, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And the continuum, while it's more complex, once I saw it on paper, it made more sense. So we'll definitely put a screenshot of that in the show notes for today's episode. What I was pleased about was that external rewards and extrinsic motivation. Yeah, I thought it was reassuring to read, and I'll quote you say, teachers must seek to foster in their students the 3 psychological needs of competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And even if initially prompted by external motivation strategies, students' intrinsic motivation will improve over time. And I think this is reassuring, particularly as a parent, because we do bribe and make deals with our kids to practice. And I remember Samantha talking about this as well, because I don't know, 5-10 years ago, I was quite against external motivation, external rewards, and I thought it was just all bad. But I've now really changed my opinion. And I think, at least myself, I'm interested in your opinion. Motivating kids externally at the start is okay. Hopefully the intrinsic will take over.
That's my hope as well. And I really try and stay away from this is good and this is bad, because even in that motivation spectrum I was just talking about, intrinsic motivation is good and extrinsic motivation is bad. Well, I could use the words like one is more valuable than the other, but in the end, both create action. They both create a call to action. They make something happen. And in the end, it's happening. So is one more valuable than the other? Yes, probably. But like most adults wouldn't go to work without the extrinsic motivation of a paycheck.
That's true.
So nothing would get done in the world.
That is true.
So these candies and stickers, is that bad? Well, some people would say so. There's long-standing motivation, also motivation literature, also by DC and Ryan. It's from 1985, that cites extrinsic motivators as undermining to intrinsic motivation. There's a lot of literature that would say that. It is less valuable, according to the literature, sure. But we know that in practical experience, maybe we need to start somewhere.
It's like lighting the flame. Like if you want a fire, you've got to spark a flame. And it's a little bit of a spark for me.
Yeah, and even if you drop into this scale on more towards the left side, we'll say, in that extrinsic motivation, could you migrate across it? So could students find their way translating that for themselves inwardly to be autonomously motivated in the end? So this scale shifts. Students flow from one side to the other quite easily. They just have to get on the scale.
Right. Okay. Do you have a story? I wonder, have you got a story or an anecdote of a student that has moved along the scale in that way, either from your own studio or the research?
Well, probably, but this is really my own story. As I was mentioning before, I turned my own corner. I quit piano for 2 years and luckily smartened up. But this is how I came to this topic partially. And it's said that all research is autobiographical. You will find the researcher in the research. So why did I turn a corner in this area? It's because I found my own way across the scale to the autonomous levels where I had to make sense of for myself, why am I doing this? And eventually I did ask myself that. I was probably 16 or 17. I'm like, hey, Karen, you're pretty good at this and you actually like it. Why don't you go back and study more seriously? And so I had wonderful teachers along the way who gave me a swift kick in the rear end. So I did need some significant external motivation. My final dear teacher, Lynn Ewing, used to call me every morning at 9:30 to make sure I was practicing.
Wow.
But I was able to find the deeper meaning for myself. And I don't practice as much as I would like to, but I can genuinely say I love practicing now. So I turned my own corner. And I think those teenage years are rough. I think we know in our practical experience with students, age 12 gets really rocky. And if you can see them through, I think we'll talk about this more later, if you can see them through to age 14, 15, 16, and they can start to find those answers for themselves, almost all of them turn that corner. And they go on to have really beautiful musical parts of their lives. Unfortunately, I think we lose too many of them in that rocky period.
And hopefully this conversation can help people rethink how they might be able to keep them during those early teenage years. And it's about, I think, I've talked before about identity. Eventually, if you get them over that hill at about 14, 15, 16, as you say, they start to identify themselves as a musician. And from then on, it's kind of snowballs much more easily than you're pushing up the hill at age 12, 13, 14.
I'm so glad you said that because that's the topic of my doctoral work now is musical identities.
Oh, really? Fascinating.
That's the point where I've landed. And this came out of research from Paul Evans and Gary McPherson.
Oh, Gary McPherson here in Australia.
They're both Australian.
Oh, right. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, you have wonderful researchers there in Australia. Paul Evans is really my research hero. And I'm sure you know about the massive longitudinal study that was done 10 or 15 years ago. These two, though, took all of that data and looked at it all again, kind of with hindsight, reanalyzed the data and came back with what they had initially labeled as commitment actually reflected something much richer. It was an identity that students were able to draw upon when they asked about their future music making. And so this is where my current thinking has led me, is that I was previously quite interested in motivation. I still am, but I think motivation might actually connect more deeply with identity.
Well, this is going to be very interesting. We'll have to get you back on as you go through your doctoral research and get some great little updates as we go.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to come back to that discussion of practice because I did find a really interesting quote, which really shocked me. And maybe I've misinterpreted it. You can help us explain here. The quote from your research says, "There is no relationship between practice time and motivation." And that surprised me. Tell us more about that.
Well, it surprised us too. And we can't say that one piece of research has all the answers. We really have no way to explain that other than we compel somebody to take up that topic and look at it again.
Right.
So we don't honestly have a good reason, because you would think that the more you practice, the more motivation you're displaying. And we just couldn't get the numbers. We looked at it in all sorts of different ways, and we couldn't make sense of that one either. So please, somebody out there, take that up as a research topic and get back to me on that one.
It aligns relatively well with me because I'm very much a teacher who, if a child, particularly in that 12, 13, 14 age group, is super busy at school or having a rough time at school and is a bit overwhelmed and has a million things to do, then I'm not going to force them to practice when it's just unreasonable. If they're just showing up, and the parents are on board with this, if they're just showing up, making some music with me once a week, maybe dabbling a little bit, I'm super okay with that. And I've saved another number of students from quitting my studio by having that relaxed attitude. So yeah, one, I kind of get it. I think that if practice is internally motivated or intrinsically motivated, then that would lead to more motivation. But if it's forced practice, then I can see why it perhaps doesn't lead to motivation.
Mm-hmm.
So have you got any thoughts for teachers about this whole practice thing and having a tough love stance or having a hard stance on it, or being kind of relaxed like I am?
Well, I have to be a little bit careful here because we didn't set out to study practicing. It was, of course, part of the study, but there's a lot of literature on practicing. So I won't say that I'm the expert on this topic. It really depends on the age of the student and their goals and their home environment. And so practice recommendations are hard to make. But we did ask students about practicing over the course of this research. And am I afraid of this tough love stance? Yes and no. Like any good academic, yes and no. So we asked students, how much do you practice? And in the early levels, they all practiced, the dropouts and continuing students practiced about the same amount. So the beginning students were about 20 to 25 minutes. And for beginner students, that's about all you can ask of them in a practice session. So totally reasonable. For levels 2 to 4, and I'm generally talking about Royal Conservatory levels here, they were practicing about 25 to 30 minutes, which is about right. That's very reasonable. But the significant difference we found was in the number of days that students were practicing. So the beginner students who continued had one more practice day per week. And the levels 2 to 4 students who continued practiced almost 2 more days per week. So given the number of weeks in a year, given the number of years that students play piano for, of course, that would compound to be a much bigger difference over time. So what we noticed when we extrapolated further and times or multiplied the number of minutes students were practicing by the number of days per week was that the students who quit practiced about half as much as the continuing students did. And so that's important because one of the main components of the self-determination theory I mentioned earlier is competency, where you need to feel competent. I need to feel like I have a mastery over this thing that I'm doing. I need to feel like I'm good at it. And so if you're struggling along through a level 2 minuet and not very well at that, what's that going to do to a student's motivation? It's probably not going to be very strong. So competency is important, and you can't get good at something if you never do it. So that tough love thing, yeah, there's got to be a little bit of that, I think. But so is autonomy. Autonomy is another word that comes up quite a lot in self-determination theory, that feeling that you have choice and ownership over the thing you're doing. And so students having that choice and ownership over their practicing and not having it forced or to be reprimanded or those sorts of extreme or strong words is also important. So this, yes, competency is important, but so is autonomy. So it's this dance. It's something that has to be negotiated carefully. And every family home dynamic will have that look different. And it's something that has to be negotiated and renegotiated as students get older, as their interests change, as parents become more or less involved. Anyway, so that's my very long yes and no answer.
Continuing on the theme of autonomy as part of self-determination theory, one of the really interesting aspects of your research, I thought, was the qualitative part where you asked for responses, written responses to various questions. And we know that a lot of our teachers that listen to the podcast are turning to more creative avenues with students these days instead of the rock solid traditional and methods and all that kind of stuff. So I was really pleased to read the comments from the students you researched about the fact that they might not have quit had they been able to play, and I quote, songs I've heard on the radio that I like. A number of parents recommended, I think my child would have played longer if they could play some popular repertoire. And I think in your conclusion, you said something like, actually, no, I've got a quote, many of the dropout students cited a lack of popular repertoire. So I think there's a little bit of the autonomy thing in here where giving students the option to choose not only when they practice, but also the music, making choice in the music that they play. But this is also about relatedness in the work we do with our students. So can you tell us about this and what you found out about what we're actually teaching our kids?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that word. That's the third really important word in self-determination theory, as relatedness, to go along with competency and autonomy. So it is so important. And I'm glad that we ask students to answer this question in their own words. For example, we literally asked them, what would have made playing the piano more fun? And I'm looking at a response here, quote, if the pieces were more interesting instead of only classical pieces composed in the 1700s.
It's just like what I've been saying for 10 years or more.
But good for that student who, first of all, capitalized the C on classical.
Well done.
And knew that the classical era was in the 1700s.
True.
Bravo to that student. So I'm a bit conflicted because my thinking has changed on this topic since collecting this data about which way does the arrow point. So we live in the golden age of guitar. There are not many examples of piano in popular culture right now. So how do we reconcile this when students don't have very many opportunities to see famous role models playing their instrument? We need to create that environment in other ways. This is Paul Evans again. And he's saying that the kinds of music a child plays and a child listens to contributes to the way that they see themselves and the role of music in their social world. So we need to create the environments in which piano music, if classical music is going to be valued and taught, we need to embrace that in different ways outside of just a weekly piano lesson. Because when a kid says, I love Bruno Mars and I hate playing Bach, they're really aligning themselves with a different world of music makers and music listeners. So can we create that world if classical music is going to be still important in this century? I think we need to do a better job of creating those environments that, can students get excited about the Brahms D minor concerto? Maybe that's a bit of a stretch to say that. But at the same time, you're right, bringing in popular repertoire is the much easier way, I suppose, to go with what we've already got and incorporating it. So I hesitate to say that we should stop teaching classical music because I think it's been around for this many years for a reason.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Karen.
Yeah.
No, I fully agree. It should be, and I use the word integrated, and I think that's the most important thing. It's like we know as teachers and players what is most sustaining and what gives most substance to music, and that often is classical because that's where you get your technique and that's where you learn about voicing and all those kinds of things. I think it's a balance that we have to strike between that and finding that connection. So either finding the connection between the Brahms D minor concerto and Bruno Mars, and there are some connections between the old and new music, and I love finding them and sharing those, or we have a bit of both in lessons. So the students have their autonomy and their relatedness in music they choose. And we also work with them on the things that we know are just good for them. It's like getting the kids to eat their veggies at dinner.
That's right. Yeah. But, my work looked a lot at teenage students, and that's an age group where they value so highly what their friends think of what they're doing. And
Yeah.
so most teenagers don't give two figs about Schubert. So I think it is important to bring in things that students can play and to say, hey, friends, look at what I can do. And if we go back to the word of relatedness, that's where we get that feeling is I matter to the people around me. And this thing that I've worked really hard to learn, because we all know how much work it takes to learn a single piece of music, matters to the people I care about.
I wanted to follow up with a slightly longer quote from your research, which I want to read because it just stood out to me and summed up everything I believe about how we should teach. So it was really reassuring to read this, Karen. So you said, teachers must present their students with personalised options rather than standardised assignments. And you've said that you do this with your students. You teach the student. Continuing the quote, you say, providing students with choices has been found to strongly relate to superior learning outcomes, and even the provision of quite trivial choices has been found to lead to increases in intrinsic motivation, higher levels of learning, and perceived confidence, which is important for motivation. Autonomy is required for the self-regulatory behaviours that foster the desire to work hard and perform with creative ownership. And the end quote there. And I've been helping teachers this kind of teaching outside the box idea and helping them, their students, learn what the students want to learn since about 2010. And I've always known innately that this, to me, has been a key to motivation for my students anyway. Why do you think it is that teachers have been often quite reticent to offer that autonomy and musical choice in their lessons?
This is just me thinking aloud here, but I think it's because it's more work. Providing those personalized repertoire choices requires an enormous knowledge of the piano repertoire and what's out there and what would be suitable for each student, that maybe not every student is going to play that Kuhlau Sonatina that you know and love. It could be this fear of the unknown. For example, this week in my studio, I have a request for the theme song of Rescue Riders. It's a cartoon. I have no idea what Rescue Riders is, but here I am on YouTube trying to figure it out. And it takes more work. So I think it's worth it in the end if we can get that response from students where they're playing something that they love and that they could say, I would play this all day because I just love this.
I'm hoping that this comes up in your work about identity, because in my opinion, in order through those ages of 10 to 15 for that identity to be strengthened, I have a feeling that for students to be able to play music for their peer group that everyone knows and loves makes the peer group go, oh, Tim's that cool piano. Tim, jump on the piano. Show us that cool thing. Can you teach me how to do that? And then Tim, or whoever that person is, builds an increasing identity. I am a musician. Everyone thinks I'm pretty cool. But as you say, it's not necessarily going to happen with Bach and things like that. They need almost those kind of show-off pieces, I think. This is just my take on research I haven't done. They need those kind of peer group show-off pieces to help with that identity. One, they enjoy playing those kind of pieces anyway. Two, they just get such positive feedback that's only going to help with their motivation. That's my thinking. Off the top of your head, what do you think?
I think you're right. I have a student whose friends call him the piano wizard.
Yeah. How cool is that for him?
And he just is loving this and owns it. He's only 8, but already I can see this amazing vision of him as this accomplished learner, just shredding the piano. And this is how I came to the topic of identity. It was in a doctoral seminar, actually, where everybody in the room thought I was a musician except myself. And they all said, wait a second, Karen, if you're not a musician, then who on earth is? And I had never used that word to think of myself in that way. And so to have students think about themselves as musicians earlier on, it matters. Yes. And that comes from that external reinforcement from their friends and from their parents and from other students and teachers and so on to say, hey, look at Tim. He's a piano wizard.
Yeah, it's very, very cool. Well, look, I think I could talk to you about this topic for a lot longer, but I'm going to start wrapping things up. I wanted to perhaps finish or lead to the finish with another quote from your research. I promise this is my last quote. I found so many. I've highlighted half this report, I think, and got little quotes out. I'm going to have to do some blog writing about it or something. My quote is, unless external motivation develops into internal self-motivation by the early teenage years, which is what we're talking about, it's going to be difficult to sustain the commitment required to persist with learning that instrument. So I wonder, do you have a little top 3 recommendations, or 5 or 1, for helping teachers bridge this gap? We've talked about repertoire choices. Any other kind of tips?
Yes. First of all, I have to acknowledge that quote is by Sloboda and Davidson, not me.
Oh, is it? Sorry.
That's okay. They are wonderful.
Quoted in your research, yes.
Yes, that's right. And there is other long-standing research that says generally the age of 14, if you can get past that, music will be with you for life. So how do we bridge that? I think it all comes back to those 3 psychological needs of self-determination theory. So the first is competency. Even if, as you were saying, maybe teenage students don't have quite the amount of time you might like for them to practice, can you still gather that sense of mastery? Even if the music is slightly simpler, even if you're teaching things that you were not familiar with, can we get that sense of I am good at this and I enjoy what I'm doing because I feel like I am awesome. The second one is relatedness. We need to create moments of connection. So either by teaching music, we already talked about that their friends find valuable, or creating a friend group that all of those friends love Bach. Who would think? So this could be teaching group lessons or recitals, master classes, field trips, some kind of student community where you care for one another. And those teenage students and tweenage students are so interested in friendships, and they really care about their place in sort of the social fabric. But ultimately, they need a feeling that they matter to those around them. So the last one is autonomy, where students study with us for a great number of years. We're so lucky as teachers, not like classroom teachers who get to see them for 10 months. We might get to see a student for 10 years, and we get to know them in a really special kind of way. We need to acknowledge that they have experiences that are brought into the piano studio and draw those out. So ultimately, teachers need to lead, but then they need to get out of the way and let students have that autonomy. Because you can't have motivation if you're missing one of these 3 things. I know we're supposed to be wrapping things up, but I want to just think about this quickly.
No, go for it.
Competency, relatedness, and autonomy. If you take one of those away, nothing makes sense anymore. So for example, competency and relatedness. If you have those 2, but you don't have autonomy, your student is thinking, well, I'm really quite good at this, and everybody I know cares about this quite deeply, but I didn't choose this for myself. That's not really going to work. So let's take away another one. If you have relatedness and autonomy, but no competency. So everybody I know cares about me doing this. This is really great. I've chosen it for myself, but I suck at it. That's not going to work either. And then the last, if you have autonomy and competency, but no relatedness. So I've chosen this for myself. I'm enjoying this. I feel like this matters to who I am. I'm really quite good at this, but nobody I know cares about what I'm doing. That's not going to work either. So you need all 3 all the time in order to have the most meaningful kind of motivation.
That's a really great summary, actually. I'm really glad you brought that up. It brings it all kind of back to that, not only to that theory, but also to how those things need to interrelate. And I really do encourage people to head to our show notes for today's episode and have a look at the links that we've got, and also the video on self-determination theory. It's like 2 minutes. It's one of those cartoon hand-drawn things. It's really, really good. And I think those examples that you've just created, Karen, for us or shared with us really helps us understand that better. So this has been so good. I really appreciate it. Was there anything else that you feel we've missed and we need to cover?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think this has been great. And if you wanted to really get into the research, I think you're going to post a link to my entire graduate work thesis. I will warn you, it's 180 pages, so beware. But that's a treasure trove of all sorts of stuff. I think I also sent you one of the articles that's in an open access journal about the predictors of piano students. And so these are things that we wondered, if the right predictors could be set in place before students begin lessons, might they continue to study for longer?
Oh, I've got to read that one now. Sounds great. And we've got a link to that in our show notes too. So look, there's heaps to go and explore. So do head into the show notes page. And Karen, where can people find out more about you and your studio?
Well, I have a website. It's www.gerelusmusic, GERELUSMUSIC.com, or you could follow me on Instagram at gerelusmusic.
I think that's where we met. Where did our paths cross? How did I find out about your research? I can't even remember.
On Instagram.
There you go. Instagram. I'm doing much more stuff on Instagram, so it's been really fun to connect with more people. There you go. Karen, it's been such a pleasure to meet you. I can't believe we haven't crossed paths in a bar at a conference, actually, now that I think about it. Next time, hopefully, when borders reopen, I can't wait to have a chat with you in person. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Not that I spend all my time in the bar, but...
It's okay. No one's listening. You can tell us.
It is a good place to meet nice people.
It is. Thanks so much.
Thank you, too.
How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today. If you enjoy this show and want to hear more of our work, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, visit us at topmusic.co/podcast or check out the show notes. I'm Tim Topham, and this is the Integrated Music Teaching Podcast, a production of Top Music. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your week ahead, and I'll catch you next time.